Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and this is a full recap of The Last of Us Season 1, released in 2023. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. About 12 years ago, one of the greatest video games of all time dropped on the PlayStation 3 titled The Last of Us, and now, on April 13th, 2025, the second season of The Last of Us television series will be debuting on Max after an incredibly successful first season, both critically and financially, and which will be based on The Last of Us Part 2 video game released back in June of 2020. So, ahead of the new season's release, we'll be taking a look back through the events of Season 1 and run down everything that took place to remind you of everything you'll need to know before Season 2. The series opens in 2003 Austin, Texas, on the 36th birthday of Joel Miller, on which he unfortunately has to work a double shift, so he's unable to celebrate it with his brother Tommy and daughter Sarah until much later that night. In the meantime, Sarah, after finishing up at school, goes to get her father's broken watch fixed as a birthday gift, before spending some time baking cookies with her neighbor Connie Adler, during which we also meet Connie's husband Danny and his elderly mother, who is in a vegetative state. It isn't until 10 o'clock that night that Joel finally returns home and Sarah can present him with his gift, which includes both the watch and a movie she'd borrowed from the Adlers, that the two watch before Sarah promptly falls asleep. And as she's sleeping, Joel receives a frustrating phone call from Tommy, revealing he'd gotten himself thrown in jail, which doesn't appear to be for the first time. And to avoid spending the entire weekend there, he needs Joel to come bail him out. So, he begrudgingly does after carrying Sarah to bed. Her sleep is later interrupted, though, by an aircraft passing oddly closely overhead, leaving her understandably concerned. Even more so when she sees a national alert on the TV, imploring everyone to stay indoors, before being suddenly met at the window by the Adler's dog Mercy, frantically clawing and whimpering. So Sarah attempts to return him home, only for him to immediately run away as they arrive at the house, and Sarah soon discovers why upon entering and witnessing the horrifying sight of Danny covered in his own blood as Connie's being torn apart by his mother, who, upon noticing Sarah's arrival, chases her out of the home, but she's fortunately saved by Joel, whacking Nana in the skull with a wrench. She's then immediately rushed into his and Tommy's truck, who aren't able to offer her much of an explanation for any of what just happened, outside of there being some sort of virus or parasite as they prepare to flee the state, although it seems everyone else already had the same idea, forcing them to cut through a field going west, where they're again blocked off by the army. So their only option left is to go through town north, find a river, and pick up the highway on the other side of the blockade. However, this plan also soon proves unviable, as they struggle to make their way through the sea of civilians fleeing on foot, while several airplanes pass overhead, one of which comes crashing down from the sky, creating a huge explosion that sends debris flying straight into their truck, momentarily incapacitating the three and totaling their vehicle. Upon regaining consciousness, Joel's able to get himself and Sarah, whose ankle had been injured in the accident, out of the wreckage, while Tommy also manages to free himself, although they're forced to split after finding themselves stuck on separate sides of the flaming vehicles. So Joel carries an injured Sarah and makes his way towards the river, only to soon be spotted and chased by one of the infected, which is fortunately gunned down before it can attack by a soldier, who then turns his gun on them and upon discovering Sarah's injury, opens fire, which Joel attempts to shield her from as they tumble down the hill beside them, and fortunately, before the soldier can finish the job, he's instead taken out by Tommy, although not soon enough, as Sarah had already been fatally wounded, and she tragically dies in her father's arms. We're then taken ahead 20 years and revisit Joel, now living in a quarantine zone in Boston, Massachusetts, set up and dictatorially run by the Federal Disaster Response Agency, also known as FEDRA, who now also control the United States military, and from whom Joel takes on several manual labor jobs to earn an income. We see though that Joel doesn't plan on staying in the QZ for much longer, as he seeks to leave in search of his brother Tommy, who despite them having gone their separate ways a few years back, had still consistently kept in contact until Tommy stopped responding 3 weeks ago. So Joel's been secretly cutting a deal with one of Fedra's soldiers, Lee, exchanging ration cards for a vehicle, the best of which Lee can offer still doesn't have a battery, so Joel's partner, Tess, has also been working to get one. However, things become difficult when the guy they agreed to buy the battery off of, Robert, ends up spending their money and selling it to someone else, forcing them to hunt him down, eventually locating him in a red-tagged building, although, after sneaking their way in, they come to find that he's been killed, while the battery he was trying to sell is also revealed to be completely useless, and they instead encounter Robert's buyer, a woman named Marlene, leader of the Fireflies, a revolutionary militia seeking to restore democratic government control, in which we learn here Tommy had actually briefly joined, leading to his and Joel's separation. Like Joel and Tess, Marlene had also been planning to leave the QZ along with the rest of her Fireflies and a young girl named Ellie, who for reasons currently unknown is very important to their cause. But since the deal with Robert for a battery went south and resulted in herself and her squad being either killed or injured, she now believes their only option is to seek Joel and Tess's help, proposing they take Ellie with them tonight and bring her to an old state house where a team of Fireflies will be waiting for her, in exchange for a fueled up truck, guns, and other supplies when they get there. And they agree. So after Fedra's mandatory curfew that night, Joel, Tess, and Ellie attempt to sneak their way out of the QZ on foot, but are soon spotted by a Fedra soldier, revealed to be Lee, who forces them on their knees to scan the three for infection, while also using this opportunity to negotiate a cut of whatever they have. However, as he goes to scan Ellie, she suddenly turns and attacks him, forcing Joel to step in on her behalf, and he manages to beat Lee to death with his bare hands, before the two subsequently discover exactly why Ellie's so important to the Fireflies, as Lee's scanner reveals that she's been infected by the cordyceps brain infection, but is yet to fall ill despite 3 weeks having already passed. This revelation understandably makes Joel and Tess question whether they should continue forward with the mission, worried that Ellie may fall ill at any moment. But Ellie reluctantly reveals that there's a Firefly base camp somewhere out west with doctors working on a cure, and they believe that whatever happened to her is the key to finding a vaccine. Joel doesn't share that same belief and suggests they just take Ellie back, but Tess convinces him to move forward, since it doesn't matter whether or not Ellie is what the Fireflies believe her to be, as long as the Fireflies believe it to be true. Unfortunately, the route they had initially planned to take ends up being cut off by a large group of infected lying on the ground. So they instead cut through the Bostonian Museum, which used to be filled with infected, but it seems that whatever was inside has finally all died, based on the bone-dry fungus outside of and throughout the building. As they're making their way up to the top floor though, the stairway caves in on itself just as they make it through, drawing the attention of two clickers, infected humans whose skulls have been split open due to advanced fungal growth on the brain, growing over or even destroying their eyes. But although they can't see, they're still able to hear the sound of Ellie's heavy breathing, leading to them attacking the trio and even managing to bite into Ellie's arm, before Joel and Tess are ultimately able to take them down with several shots to the head. Having just narrowly survived the attack, the three are able to make it out of the building and eventually all the way to where Marlene said some of her Fireflies would be waiting for Ellie, only to find them all dead, one having been bit and the others having failed to fight them off. So Joel decides enough is enough and demands they head back to the QZ, but Tess refuses, revealing she'd been bit during the previous attack, and she insists that Joel has to see this out to make up for all the awful things they've had to do, asking that he take her to Bill and Frank before she's suddenly interrupted by one of the infected awakening, forcing Joel to put a bullet in their head. But this ends up attracting the crowd of infected they passed earlier, since if you step on a patch of cordyceps in one place, you can wake up a dozen infected from somewhere else. So Tess sets the place to blow by knocking over several fuel drums and scattering grenades, and after further insistence from Tess, Joel grabs Ellie and drags her out of there, while she stays behind and lights a flame, sacrificing herself in a huge explosion to prevent them from being followed. Let's now jump back again to around when this all started, as we're taken to Lincoln, Massachusetts and introduced to a survivalist named Bill, watching from his bunker as his neighbors are taken away by US soldiers, likely to a QZ. And once everyone's gone, he briefly heads out of town to gather even more supplies, ensuring a comfortable life for himself over the course of the next 4 years, with running water, a gas stove, heating, and electricity, all the while keeping himself protected from the infected thanks to several booby traps and an electrified fence. However, one day in 2007, an uninfected human named Frank ends up caught in one of his traps, claiming he'd been looking for his way to the Boston QZ after the Baltimore QZ had been overrun. So Bill offers to let him walk free and gives him directions to Boston, but Frank continues pushing his luck in hopes that Bill would be willing to offer him something to eat. And luckily for Frank, 4 years on his own convinces Bill to let him inside. After finishing their meal, Frank asks for one last thing before he heads off on his way, to play a song on Bill's piano, next to which he finds a copy of sheet music for Linda Ronstadt's song Long Long Time. However, shortly after he starts playing, Bill asks that he stop, and it appears Bill has something personal related to that song. So Frank asks that he play it instead, and Bill does, giving an emotional performance that Frank can tell isn't, as one would initially expect, the results of a woman Bill had lost, as Frank leans in to kiss Bill, who kisses him back. In the 3 years following their first encounter, Bill and Frank find themselves in a full-on romantic relationship, But while happy together, Frank does desire the friendship of others, so he begins speaking with a woman over the radio, soon revealed to be Tess, who they invite, along with Joel, over for lunch one day in 2010. And while Bill understandably questions their intentions, they prove themselves to be decent people, willing to work and trade with one another. They continue sporadically trading and building somewhat of a friendship throughout the following decade. Although, also during this period, Frank unfortunately develops a medical condition that by 2023 leaves him wheelchair-bound. And after dealing with his disease for a considerable amount of time, Frank decides on August 29, 2023 that it will be his final day. A decision that leaves Bill greatly distraught, but he looks to give Frank one last good day nonetheless. With the two getting married beside the piano and sharing the same delicious dinner they had the day they'd first met 16 years ago. To end the night, Frank asks that Bill crush up all of his pills and pour them into his wine so he can go into sleep. And Bill does, although he also decides to put pills in his own wine, satisfied with the life the two have shared. And so they slowly make their way to bed and ultimately pass in each other's arms. Back to Joel and Ellie now, as they finally arrive at Bill and Frank's home, where Bill's left Joel a note revealing to him what they decided to do, as well as where he can find anything he may need. So he and Ellie grab everything they can before driving off in Bill's car as they begin on their way to find Joel's brother Tommy, both to ensure he's okay and in hopes that he may know where the Fireflies are. After a night spent in the woods to get some sleep, the two head back out on the road, traveling for some time before finding themselves cut off by a blockade in Kansas City. So they're forced to cut through the city streets in order to get back on the highway. And as they're passing through, they come across the entrance to the Kansas City QZ, although it appears to have no Fedra soldiers in sight, before they're then called out to by a seemingly injured man, who Joel can tell is attempting to fool them, so he steps on the gas straight at him. However, their vehicle is immediately taken out by an ambush that sends them crashing into an abandoned laundromat. Still, Joel's able to successfully cover Ellie as she crawls her way into hiding, and actually manages to gun down two of them before being immediately snuck up on by a third, who nearly chokes Joel to death. But he's fortunately saved by Ellie firing a gun, which he'd secretly taken from Bill and Frank's home, into the man's back, allowing Joel to then finish him off with a fatal stab. The three men's bodies are then found shortly after Joel and Ellie exit by the group that had managed to overthrow Fedra in the Kansas City QZ, who make it their mission to find those who killed them, forcing Joel and Ellie to hide out for a while, before eventually making their way to a nearby tall building and managing to get all the way up 33 flights of stairs, after which they call it a night and head to sleep. However, in the middle of the night, they're awoken by a pair of brothers holding them at gunpoint, although the brothers don't actually intend to harm them, and just require their help. After the Kansas City QZ was taken over by the Resistance 10 days ago, the citizens who'd acted as informants for Fedra were nearly all rounded up and killed, outside of their most wanted collaborator, Henry Burrell, since we learn it was the information Henry had given to Fedra that resulted in the death of the Resistance original leader, Michael Coughlin, who Henry had actually looked up to, but when his brother Sam was diagnosed with leukemia and needed treatment, he gave Michael up in exchange for it. This has now made him the Resistance's new leader, Michael's sister Kathleen's #1 priority. So he and Sam were gearing up to attempt an escape from the QZ just before Joel and Ellie showed up. And after seeing what Joel's capable of, Henry now proposes they work together to make it out of here, and Joel reluctantly agrees. To get out of the QZ, they'll have to head underground and travel through the city's maintenance tunnels, where Henry knows Kathleen and her army won't be waiting, since 15 years ago, Fedra had driven all the infected in the city underground. But while many believe the infected are still trapped down there, Henry had been told by the Fedra officer he collaborated with that they'd actually been cleared out 3 years back, which Joel doesn't completely believe. But seeing no other way out, he agrees to move forward. Unfortunately, they don't come across any infected as they make their way through the tunnels and back up on the other side of the QZ. However, not long after exiting the tunnels, they're suddenly shot at by a sniper in the distance, who luckily has terrible aim, allowing Joel to sneak into his home through the back and take him out. Although it seems not fast enough, as over the man's radio, it's revealed that Kathleen and her army are also on their way. So while Joel's able to take one of the vehicles out by sniping its driver, Ellie, Sam, and Henry are ultimately surrounded, forcing the latter to come out of hiding in hopes the kids are able to escape. But things then take a sudden turn when the truck Joel had intercepted gets swallowed by a hole in the ground, out from which hundreds of infected emerge, including our first introduction to a bloater, unleashing a brutal attack that kills Kathleen and her army, while Joel, Ellie, Henry, and Sam just narrowly manage to avoid being torn apart and escape into a house nearby. Sadly though, after Henry and Joel head to sleep for the night, Sam reveals to Ellie that he'd been wounded by an infected, which she tries to aid by cutting open her hand and putting some of her immune blood on it, as well as attempting to stay awake with him through the night. But she ultimately falls asleep, and by morning, discovers that he's turned, as he rushes towards and attacks her, prompting Joel to go for his gun, but it's instead grabbed by Henry, who points it at Joel, unsure of what to do, before eventually turning it on and shooting his brother to save Ellie, followed by him suddenly shooting himself in the head. In the 3 months following Sam and Henry's horrifying deaths, Joel and Ellie continue forward on their journey to Wyoming, although at some point they lose track of where they are, and as they're trying to find their way, they're suddenly surrounded by several armed men and women on horseback. However, this encounter proves to be a blessing for Joel, as upon revealing his name and that he's just looking for his brother, he and Ellie are permitted to join them on their way back to their settlement, where Joel's finally reunited with Tommy. After scoffing down their first proper meal in a long time, Joel and Ellie are then given a tour of the town by Tommy and his wife Maria, the woman who led them back here and who we learn is also a member of the town's council, before Maria and Ellie eventually split from the two so Maria can help her settle in, while Tommy and Joel head to the bar to speak alone. There, Joel vaguely discusses why he's brought Ellie here along with him, and is able to learn from Tommy of a Firefly base down at the University of Eastern Colorado, to which Joel suggests Tommy come with them, but he declines since he has a baby on the way, a revelation that Joel responds to coldly, much to Tommy's frustration.
Just because life stopped for you doesn't mean it has to stop for me.
Meanwhile, Ellie, after taking a shower and getting a change of clothes, heads over to Maria's home, in which she comes across a memorial Tommy had made that she believes to be for just Maria's children. Maria reveals that it's actually for her son Kevin and Joel's daughter Sarah, who Ellie hadn't learned anything about until now. Later that evening, Joel's met again by Tommy, who apologizes for what he'd said, but it seems his words have finally convinced Joel to open up, as he reveals that Ellie is immune and that the Fireflies believe she's the key to her cure, but he no longer feels strong enough to see this through to the end, having almost gotten himself and Ellie killed several times now, so he asks that Tommy be the one to take her, believing he's her best chance at surviving, and Tommy reluctantly agrees. It turns out though that Ellie had been following close behind them and overheard their entire conversation, so she confronts Joel for abandoning her and questions why he's so afraid, which she assumes has to do with the loss of his daughter. But this claim appears to upset him even more, and he insists that they'll be going their separate ways at dawn. By morning though, Joel decides that the choice is really Ellie's to make, so he allows her to choose who she'd rather have by her side, and she, of course, chooses Joel. So they continue on their way to the university together and eventually make it there, only to find it's been recently abandoned, with a map inside revealing they'd fled to Salt Lake City. Not long following their arrival, a group of raiders arrive as well, who they try and fail to avoid as Joel's suddenly attacked by one with a bat, but he impressively manages to quickly gain the upper hand and snap the man's neck, although not before being stabbed through the abdomen with a broken bat, which leaves him bleeding heavily as they escape the remaining raiders, after which Joel soon falls unconscious off their horse. Fortunately, there's a house close enough that Ellie's able to get Joel inside of, but with seemingly no way to stop the bleeding, Joel orders her to leave and head back to Tommy's settlement. And this fear of losing someone she cares so much about brings Ellie back to a few weeks prior to her first meeting Joel and during her time at the Fedra Military School, where she was raised as an orphan. There she became close with another young girl named Riley, until the two were separated for the first time in years when Riley suddenly went missing. But eventually, she snuck her way back into the school through Ellie's bedroom window and revealed that she'd left to join the Fireflies. Before she explained anything further, she asked Ellie to sneak out of the school with her so they could spend the night together, and Ellie reluctantly agreed, following Riley all the way to the mall where she'd been hiding out, and which also happened to still have working lights and electronics, including the carousel, a photo booth, and an arcade. But as the night neared its end, Riley was forced to deliver some upsetting news, revealing that the Fireflies were sending her to a post in the Atlanta QZ, so this would be her last night in Boston, which greatly saddened Ellie and nearly led her to storm back to the school. But she almost immediately turned back around to enjoy the last hour they had together, putting on Halloween masks and dancing to some music. Although, Ellie soon interrupted the party to plead with Riley not to leave, and Riley actually agreed before the two shared their first kiss. However, before they could even figure out what they'd do next, an infected that had been inside the mall all this time entered the room and rushed towards them, knocking them each to the ground and appearing to nearly bite them both. But Ellie was ultimately able to put it down with a stab through the skull. Sadly though, the damage had already been done, as Ellie was revealed to have been bitten in the arm, while Riley's hand was also wounded. But despite the heartbreaking circumstances, Riley believed they shouldn't give up the little time they had left together. So the two fell into each other's arms and waited for their time to run out, which we know now never did for Ellie. But Riley's insistence that they shouldn't give up prompts Ellie in the present, rather than leaving Joel, to search throughout the house for a way to save him. And she fortunately finds a needle and thread with which she's able to stitch up his wound. Without any food, water, or medication though, Joel's injuries are unable to properly heal. So Ellie, with him still out of commission, heads off on her own to hunt them down something to eat, fortunately soon spotting a deer that she manages to hit, although not well enough to immediately take down as it runs off quickly before ultimately succumbing to its wound, and instead being found by a pair of men named David and James, the former of whom, after being disarmed and held at gunpoint by Ellie, reveals himself to be the leader of a village a few miles back, who only have enough food left to last them a couple of weeks, and so offers to exchange the deer for something else, and Ellie agrees, ordering James to bring back medicine from their village and threatening to kill David if James doesn't return alone. After waiting for some time, David reveals to Ellie that due to the cruel winter that's left them struggling to find food, he had to send 4 of his men to a nearby town to scavenge anything they could, from which only 3 of them returned after a crazy man with a young girl killed one. And just as Ellie realizes he's talking about her and Joel, James returns with his gun aimed at her. Surprisingly though, David orders him to lower his weapon and give her the medicine before allowing her to run off. Although, upon returning home, he reveals plans of tracking her and her friend down in the morning. Meanwhile, Ellie injects a dose of the medicine into Joel's wound, and then again after a night's rest, before then noticing David and his men approaching. So she tries to wake Joel up, but fails, leaving her to instead attempt to lure them away from Joel's location by firing at them and fleeing on her horse, although James manages to quickly shoot it down, sending her flying off and knocking her unconscious. However, they don't take this opportunity to kill her, as David instead orders them to continue their search for Joel while he and James take her back with them to their village. Shortly following their departure, however, their manhunt almost immediately goes south when Joel manages to sneak up on and kill one of them, before capturing and torturing the remaining 2 until they tell him the location of their village. And once they've done that, he brutally kills them as well. Ellie, meanwhile, awakens locked in a cell, just outside of which she notices a severed ear on the floor, as David enters with food for her to eat, although she refuses to touch it, correctly assuming that they've been chopping up and eating people, which leads David to discuss the struggles he's had with his violent heart before the world ended and he was shown the truth, although not by the gods, but the cordyceps, which taught him that sometimes you must use violence to secure your future. He's grown tired of having to play God for his people though, describing himself as a shepherd surrounded by sheep, and believes that Ellie could finally be his equal. So he proposes they lead together whilst gently caressing her hand, but this just allows her to break one of his fingers and nearly grab his keys, to which he responds by smashing her head into the cage, before James then joins him in dragging her out of her cell as they prepare to chop her to bits. However, their attempt is thwarted when she bites into David's hand, gets hold of his cleaver, and sends it straight into James' face before attempting to flee, only to find herself, unfortunately, locked inside the building. And after failing to launch a flaming piece of wood at David, which sets the place on fire, she's eventually caught and pinned to the ground. But thankfully, she's just barely able to regain possession of his cleaver and repeatedly stab him with it to death, just moments before Joel finally arrives and the two are reunited. Ellie's understandably traumatized by everything that had unfolded, and so isn't at all her usual self for much of the rest of their journey, despite Joel's attempts to raise her spirits, which leads him to suggest that they just turn back to Tommy's now to avoid any further risk. But Ellie insists they see this through to the end, so that everything they'd gone through wasn't just for nothing. Although she does assure him that, once they're done, she'll follow him wherever he goes. So they continue forward, nearly arriving at the hospital before suddenly they're knocked back by a flashbang grenade, then followed by the arrival of several guards, who capture Ellie and knock out Joel. It turns out though that these guards were patrol fireflies, unaware of who they were, as Joel's informed when he awakens in a hospital bed by Marlene, who thanks him for getting Ellie here, but reveals he won't be permitted to see her, as she's being prepped for surgery, explaining that their doctor believes that the cordyceps in Ellie have grown with her since birth and produce a kind of chemical messenger that makes normal cordyceps think she's cordyceps. So they're hoping they can remove it from her, multiply the cells in a lab, and use it as a cure for everyone. However, since cordyceps grows in the brain, the procedure will result in Ellie's death, which Joel refuses to accept, again demanding he be taken to see her, but Marlene won't allow it. instead attempting to comfort him by revealing that they'd kept the risks of the surgery hidden from Ellie so she wouldn't be afraid, and expresses a deep understanding of what Joel's feeling, since we learn Marlene was a lifelong friend of Ellie's birth mother, Anna, who'd become infected shortly after giving birth, and so made Marlene promise she'd protect her daughter, a promise Marlene's now been left no choice but to break. Without even the chance to say goodbye to her, Joel's then escorted out of the building by a pair of fireflies. However, it isn't long before he suddenly strikes one of them, gets a hold of his gun, and kills the pair, before then making his way through the rest of the hospital and horrifically murdering everyone else in his path until he finally makes it to Ellie's operating room, and shockingly shoots the doctor through the head in order to get her released. Although, upon making it down to the parking garage with her in his arms, he's again met by Marlene, who questions him at gunpoint if this is really what Ellie would have wanted. And despite knowing deep down that she would have wanted to do what's right, Joel still decides to shoot and kill Marlene as well. When Ellie later regains consciousness, he claims that the Fireflies had actually found dozens of people immune like her, but the doctors were unable to find anything that could help them make a cure, and so have stopped looking. And while they were running tests, raiders attacked the hospital, resulting in the deaths of nearly everyone, while he just barely got her out alive. A story Ellie appears skeptical of, and so, after a long drive, and ahead of their final stretch of their journey back to Tommy's settlement, she asks Joel to swear that everything he told her was really true, and he swears it was, leaving her to reluctantly trust his word as the season ends. And that was our recap of The Last of Us Season 1. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also let us know in the comments below which version of The Last of Us you prefer, the game or the series. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.